Happy Sunday, everybody. Today we're talking about whether it's okay to be a bigot against the Mormons. Something that perhaps this question might answer itself, and yet want to pick at it a little bit and try and understand, why is this socially tolerated? Why in our society is it acceptable to proffer bigoted statements against members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, unlike perhaps any other group? Let's begin with what made the news in past, 6 to 9 months. Earlier this year in February, one of BYU's sports teams beat Arizona 96-65. I believe it was basketball. I don't do sports. I'm pretty sure this was basketball. And, half the audience is now rolling their eyes. 96-65. And of course, what is well known after the game was this chant. Now, this game was not an anomaly. This wasn't relegated only to the fans of Arizona. There have been a number of other instances in which this has happened.
The Mormons! The Mormons!
Well, after the Arizona game in particular, the athletic director issued a statement saying, following tonight's men's basketball game, there you go, basketball, it was brought to our attention that an unacceptable chant occurred. On behalf of the University of Arizona Athletic Department, we apologize to BYU, their student athletes, coaches, and fans. The chant is not reflective of who we are and should not have happen. Well, of course, for there to be any really sincere apology in this context, one wonders if any action was taken against the offending students that were guilty of doing this unacceptable chant, right? Did they even receive a stern reprimand of any kind? Was there any sort of discipline or even a talking to, right? Or the NCAA, right? Did anyone do anything other than, "aw shucks, we're sorry," which clearly, does not impede other student groups from doing something similar when they see that there's going to be no type of accountability or any type of even just persuasive effort. I'm not saying there needs to be formal discipline against, speech, but one can try and engage in the cultural milieu and say, hey, I think that's wrong, and hey, knock it off, right? And call it out directly to the faces of those responsible. And of course, the issue here is that if this occurred, this type of chant, with any other faith or ethnic minority group, a hollow apology would not suffice, right? Like, that particular group, whoever would be the aggrieved party in this example, would not be content with a surface level apology from some random athletic director, right? The media would blow it up. It would be a big thing. There'd be a lot of fury and furor around the entire thing. And, if you lose a sporting event and this is your reaction, I think you're a bigot, right? Like, would you do this to a black man, right? If it was a team of a bunch of, black people that won the game, would you do it to a Mexican, a Muslim, a Jew, gay people, right? Pick your minority group of whatever type. And you don't really see this type of chanting done today. It's almost like anti-Mormon bigotry is kind of the last acceptable kind, where everyone's just kind of cool with it. Of course, Latter-day Saints aren't really known for beheading people or otherwise fighting back when they are the ones that are the targets of this type of attack. But this raises a broader question, this double standard, this concern of why it's supposedly okay to do this with Mormons and not with anyone else. It reminded me of this interview I saw on Piers Morgan earlier this year. This is in the context of racism, but it makes an interesting point we'll discuss after. Take a look.
Here, black women cannot be racist to white women. Are you kidding me?
Sorry?
That makes no sense.
Sorry?
Black women cannot be racist to white women. Do you not understand that?
Oh, yes, they can.
You don't have to intellectually
Oh, yes, they can.
to understand that?
Oh, yes, they
That's
can.
very much
And you've been racist to me.
That's very much
You've been racist to me, a white man, by saying I'm a respecter. Yeah.
How am I racist to you? I'm black. I can't be racist.
You call me a race baiter with no evidence.
to me.
When have I been a race baiter?
You could be racist to me.
When have I been a race
but I'm a
baiter?
powerhouse.
So the idea that this black woman simply can't be racist because she's black, that it's okay to be racist against white people, which is what much of DEI has become and is, but it's all okay because that's not racism. Racism again is when it's against blacks, apparently, according to black people like this. But when they themselves are the instigators of the same type of racial discrimination and ire, they're not racists because somehow in their head they've deluded themselves into thinking that it's only when they themselves are the victims. It's this total double standard, right? It's selectively applied. And I think we see the same thing in religion. Other religions, people, their own religion, they would not tolerate anyone kind of bullying them or being bigoted against them. But they perceive somehow in their warped minds that when they're doing it to members of the LDS Church, that it's okay. It follows social norms, just like for crazy black people like this that are wrapped up in their DEI nonsense. They just can't see differently enough to understand the truth. Now, you know, the problem we have to grapple with, I think, and I've talked about this in a past musing about why Americans hate Mormons, is that Mormons, by and large, aren't well liked. And I think it's very connected to this issue of the last acceptable bigotry, something that's not reserved for any other major religion. And perhaps one of the issues is that Mormons are a rather small amount of people, right? So the larger a community is, or the more positions of influence they have, perhaps like Jews, right? The worse it gets to make fun of them because the likelihood of backlash is much greater. But when you have a small group of people and one that perhaps doesn't have the same level of cultural influence and leverage, then it's easier to attack them. Now, being small in number doesn't entirely account for it, because you could look at like the Scientologists, right, or some other group, Jehovah's Witnesses, and you don't see the same level. It's almost, I almost wonder if it's like, okay, tiny little groups that are staying in their lane and, you know, not really doing much. They're just there. We can kind of ignore them, whatever. But it's like the small groups that are punching above their weight and doing something much bigger that draw attention and the ire of people to, you know, push back and make fun of them. But the data shows, according to a Pew survey that was done in 2022, that Americans hate us more than any other religion. So the question was, how favorably do you view each of the religious groups? And Latter-day Saints were included in there. A quarter of Americans say that they hold a very or somewhat unfavorable view of Mormons, while only 15% express favorable opinions. That I mean, compared to the atheists, if you're watching the video version, check this out. Here's the resulting graphic, and you can see more people have a favorable view of atheists at 20% than they do for Latter-day Saints. And we're, you know, based on the margin of error, we're basically tied even for the somewhat unfavorable or very or somewhat unfavorable views. But we're at the bottom for people to have a favorable impression of us, despite the service, despite the, you know, attempts and the marketing and the I'm a Mormon campaign and all the stuff. Among these groups, we're at the bottom. And so I think that very much plays into this fact that we're like the little kid on the playground getting picked on, right? We're the little runt that can't defend himself. And as we'll talk about in a second, maybe chooses not to defend himself, therefore enticing the bully to continue, knowing that he's going to get away with it. This is somewhat tangential, and I've only watched maybe a sum total of like 4 minutes of South Park ever in my life, but I felt like this clip not only is hilarious, but somewhat related enough to this question of differing religions and us being picked on and being at the bottom. Check it out.
Can everybody, okay. I'm the Hell Director. It looks like we have about 8,615 of you newbies today. And for those of you who were a little confused, you are dead and this is Hell. So abandon all hope and yada, yada, yada. We're now going to start the orientation process, which will last about...
Hey, wait a minute. I shouldn't be here. I was a totally strict and devout Protestant. I thought we went to heaven.
Yes, well, I'm afraid you were wrong.
I was a practicing Jehovah's Witness.
You picked the wrong religion as well.
Well, who was right? Who gets into heaven?
I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct answer.
All right. So again, I think what we have here is a bit of a religious double standard. The F the Mormons type chant, right? People wouldn't do that against Jews. They wouldn't do it against Muslims. Think, for example, of back in 2005, when a Danish newspaper published 12 editorial cartoons featuring Muhammad, the founder of Islam, sometimes in unflattering, teasing, mocking kind of light. There were protests all across the world in late January 2005, we're into 2006 now. So the cartoons were published. There was some building tension. The newspaper kind of stood their ground. And then in January and February of 2006 is when you had these protests all over the world, some of them escalating to violence. More than 250 deaths were reported as a result of all of these protests and all the commotion. There were attacks on Danish diplomatic missions like embassies and whatnot in other countries, other Europeans as well. There were attacks on churches and Christians, a boycott of Denmark by a lot of people. Like, there was just a big backlash. And so there's a lot of sensitivity around picking on any Muslims as a result, because we see the type of carnage and chaos that can result when, Muslims push back and don't tolerate, having their founding prophet of Islam, picked on and depicted, right? Because that's even verboten in their faith. By contrast, Mormons are made fun of. Our sacred rituals are shared and mocked online. Sacred, the garment and everything, like over and over and over again, you have what we consider sacred and not for public consumption, let alone mocking, being shared for public consumption and being mocked. And yet, nothing. And so we say, oh yeah, well, we Mormons, we can take a joke, right? Like, which perhaps just reinforces the idea that we're at the bottom of the cultural hierarchy, right? We say that to like comfort ourselves and pretend like we're taking the higher road, but it's also like, oh, you're the runt of the litter, right? And you couldn't really do anything about it. Anyways, I'm reminded, of course, of the Book of Mormon play, which I think largely is, I would call it, anti-Mormon. It's much more from a mocking vantage point than any type of praiseworthy, even though they're, from what I understand, I haven't seen it, but I've seen enough analysis of it to make that type of conclusion based on what so many others have said who've watched it. But the point is, what was the church's response to all this? You probably know they ran an ad in the playbill, and the ad said the book is better, right? And it was a promotion of the actual Book of Mormon, and the church was praised in many marketing circles, at least, for having this kind of high road response of not getting into the gutter, not fighting back, not criticizing, not licking our wounds or whatever, but almost just like wink, wink, yeah, okay, we get it. You're over there teasing us, but hey, check out the book. Like, I think it was a good response, but it definitely does run into this idea that we might respond differently if we had more cultural influence, perhaps, if we had more positions of leverage and influence in society. Just as the kid getting bullied on the playground can't really do much, right? If that kid perhaps hits puberty and lifts weights and gets really muscular, it's a deterrence. That doesn't mean that the once picked on kid has to go around swinging fists, but having more strength becomes a deterrence for being attacked by others. This, of course, all bubbled up most particularly during Mitt Romney's presidential campaigns, when a Mormon was trying to obtain the most politically powerful position in the world. And there were a lot of people from other faiths or no faith, attacking Romney, attacking the church, attacking Mormons. As a result, it definitely introduced the church and its various doctrines or poorly understood versions of the doctrines in the minds of other people into the cultural zeitgeist, and it allowed for a lot of this kind of anti-Mormon prejudice to bubble up. People of other faiths or no faith just launching these very kind of prejudiced, bigoted type of attacks against the weird Mormons or whatever, right? I want to read briefly from an article that came out in 2011 in the Christian Science Monitor, talking about this issue. The author says, I have a dear friend who grew up in Utah and teaches at a major East Coast university. When she first arrived at her job, a colleague asked her if she was a Mormon. She said yes. But you don't believe in that stuff, right? The colleague said. Imagine if my friend were Muslim or Jewish. In the liberal confines of academia, no one would ever inquire if she really believed in her religion. The very question would be offensive, because it implies that the religion is somehow unbelievable. But my friend is a Mormon, so people feel free to ask. And that tells you all you need to know about anti-Mormonism in America right now. It's a prejudice you can get away with. You can't be openly racist, sexist, or anti-Semitic, but anti-Mormon? Go for it. It's thoroughly bipartisan, too. Amid the recent controversy over Republican attacks on GOP frontrunner Mitt Romney's Mormon faith, it would be easy to conclude that conservatives have a monopoly on anti-Mormon bigotry, but it would also be wrong. If anything, liberals are more prejudiced against Mormons than conservatives are. In a poll last June by the Pew Research Center, for example, 31% of Democrats, as compared to 23% of Republicans, said they'd be less likely to support a presidential candidate if he were a Mormon. And in a Gallup survey taken the same month, 27% of Democrats, as opposed to 18% of Republicans, said they wouldn't vote for a Mormon for president. He concludes, or at least I'm in the last paragraph I'll read, he says, to put these numbers in perspective, only 3% of respondents in the Pew survey said they'd be less likely to vote for a candidate if he were African American. The real fraction of racists is probably much higher than that, sociologists say, because respondents are afraid to reveal anti-Black biases, but they're not nearly as reticent to express prejudice against Mormons. And that, too, speaks volumes about which kinds of intolerance our society is willing to tolerate. Now, I don't know that much has changed since then. Perhaps just it's more subdued and pushed into the sideline of society because you don't have this very focused, concentrated attention on one individual seeking the highest political position in, frankly, the world, which therefore attracts a ton of attention and commentary and analysis and response from other people. But if you just have this kind of distributed Mormonism where you've got a random senator here and a random businessman here and a random Instagram influencer over there, right? And the guys at Angel Studios, that's one we hear from time to time, like with The Chosen and other things, or, the author of the Tuttle Twins and the illustrator, they're Mormon. Like you get these tiny little pockets of concern, but not this like society-wide thing that's pushed into the mainstream media and so forth, right? But it's still there. It's still this undercurrent in society where in moments like at the Arizona BYU game, right, it spills out and it's clear that, okay, like the athletic director felt to maintain relationship with NCAA and BYU and so forth that he had to do that. But who knows? That individual might have himself been very sympathetic to that, but felt professionally required to issue this weak apology. So it still exists and it still bubbles up. I don't think it's going away. But let's talk about our response. The church put the little haha, go read the book in the playbill. When I think of this anti-Mormon type of prejudice and bigotry and attacks, first of all, I think it's like grounded in abject ignorance, and it's people who have a lack of any understanding of our doctrine, our culture. They're responding to memes and mischaracterizations and how things are kind of stereotypically displayed rather than any sincere engagement or understanding of our ideas. And so it's kind of like a Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. Like they're just, ignoramuses caught up in the, great and spacious building and doing what everyone else is doing, right? But many people in response would say, well, what about Jesus saying that we should turn the other cheek? There's this idea that when we are attacked, when someone comes after us, we should turn the other cheek. This comes, of course, from the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, verse 39, Jesus says, I say unto you that you resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And so this verse, I think, has been interpreted very superficially, very, conventionally, that God requires pacifism in a certain sense, right? We're to take a beating and not defend ourselves. If they attack us, we should allow them to attack us again. They hit us on one cheek, okay, turn the other cheek so they can continue their assault, right? And that's like this, I think, the superficial understanding of what Jesus is saying. But if you introduce the cultural context, then I think it sheds a bit of a different light on what's going on and what Jesus is talking about. First, think of this question. Why did Jesus name a specific cheek? Again, he said, whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other, or the left, also. So he's specifically referring to people attacking you on your right cheek. He didn't say, whoever hits you on one of your cheeks, turn to the other side. No, he starts with the right, then he goes to the left. Why would he have done that? Well, in the ancient world, the left hand was considered unclean. And so in order to strike an adversary on their right cheek, you would have to use your right hand, right? Because you don't want to use your left hand because it's unclean. And so if I'm going to strike you on your right cheek, I have to use my right hand, and I have to do a kind of a backhand slap type of thing, right? And this type of attack is more of an insult. It's not a provocation for a fist fight. It's a way that inferiors were reprimanded, right? A master to a slave, a husband to a wife, a Roman to a Jew, the backhanded slap, right? That's how you hit someone on the right cheek, which suggests to me that Jesus is saying something different. Not that we should submit ourselves to abuse, and certainly not a fist swinging back in the other direction, right? But turning the cheek so that the person would have to respond to you as a social equal. Because again, if I'm using my right hand, and in order to hit you on your right cheek, I'm doing a backhanded slap. But if you turn the left cheek to me and basically say, you want to continue this? That's going to change it from me insulting you to me having, and if I'm willing to, give you a fistful in your left cheek, as my right arm, my right fist would naturally be able to do. So turning the cheek basically says, I'm not your inferior. I'm not your slave. You're not my master. Right. And so you can't get away with this backhanded slap insult. If you want to engage with me, I am your social equal. Right? You have to look me in the eyes. I am a child of God, just like you. I'm your brother. And so if you're going to assault me, then have the gumption to do it as your equal and not pretending that I'm your inferior. So it's a directive perhaps to act in a way that your attacker might least expect by refusing to respond in like kind. Again, Jesus isn't saying slap them back or fight back, but instead, like Jesus did, right? The Pharisees would often come after him and he'd kind of wiggle around their questions and then get at a core issue. It seems like he's saying, we have a similar opportunity here to kind of throw off the other person and say, no, I'm not going to play that game. You're going to play my game. And if you want to continue, fine, let's have that conversation, but I'm going to reframe this situation. So to me, that sheds a bit of new light on this question of when we are attacked, must we submissively and meekly turn the other cheek and require or allow the abuse to continue? No. So the question becomes, maybe we push back in a way not to return the favor, not to insult and say, anything mean about anybody else, but to demand equal station in society and say, sorry, but, if you're going to continue doing that, then I'm going to make it more difficult for you to do, because I'm going to make very clear to you and readers and listeners or viewers that we are social equals, and what you're doing is not acceptable, just as you wouldn't be doing it to black people or to Jews or to gay people or whatever. There's also an element of this all being okay, that Mormons being the brunt of bigotry is par for the course. It's accepted. It's acceptable, even in a sense. 2 Timothy 3, verse 12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Throughout the scriptures, again and again and again, prophets and the Lord have said that the righteous would be persecuted. Jesus himself, Sermon on the Mount, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So Jesus is saying, hey, like, you're in good company, right? They did this to the prophets of old. They did it to Jesus himself. If you're reviled, if you're persecuted, you're in good company. You'll inherit the kingdom of heaven. You're on the Lord's errand doing the right thing. It's like the saying that I think arose out of World War II or Vietnam War or whatever it was, that you're over the target if you're catching flak, right? If you're a plane flying over the target where you're going to drop a bomb or whatever, and if they're shooting back at you, that means you're above the target. You're in the right spot. And if you're not catching flak, if you're not being persecuted, one might infer that you are not speaking up, opening your mouth, rebuking wickedness, wasting and wearing out your life and bringing to light hidden things of darkness, being anxiously engaged in a good cause, right? Causing the devil's kingdom to shake a little bit and get off balance. That if we are doing what we ought, then there is going to inevitably be a response. Just as prophets of old were all, rebuked and stoned and persecuted and killed. And so there's this sense of, just like Jesus says, like, these are the signs that will follow believers, right? In my name, they'll be able to cast out devils and heal the sick and all the things. And he's basically saying, watch for people who can do this. Those are the fruits of the people that are following me and have my authority. So too, can we identify a bit, perhaps, like, look at the people who are being persecuted? Not that it's like a one-to-one relationship, or not that Mormons are the only ones persecuted. I'm not saying any of that, but it stands to reason that if there's heightened levels of persecution for God's followers, for Latter-day Saints in particular, that becomes at least an interesting little exclamation mark on top of what Jesus is saying here about being blessed for being persecuted. And then, of course, there's the inverse in Luke 6. Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. Right? So you're blessed if you're persecuted, but if they start saying nice things about you, if you start ingratiating yourself in society, if everyone's nice and copacetic with you, that means that you are not, shaking things up, because inevitably in the fallen world that we're in and the heightened levels of sin that abound all around us, if we're going along to get along, then the devil's like, oh, okay, he's cool. That's fine. Speak well of him. He's one of us. Right? No, it's if we stand our ground and say that is wrong and I don't believe that and I don't support that, that's when we get the pushback and the persecution. And so it's almost this barometer to measure our engagement and how well we're standing up for truth and righteousness is, what is the response from the devil's kingdom? We know we're building God's kingdom perhaps best by how much the devil's kingdom is trying to fight us in our efforts of doing so. And if things feel copacetic and other people are speaking well of us and we're one of you, we're like you, right? Like ingratiating ourselves in society and pretending we're this Americanized church like apple pie and whatever, that runs the risk of putting us in the position of not wanting to call a spade a spade. I see this all the time. This is just human dynamics. This is relationships. I've seen it in a political context where, when a lobbyist or an advocacy group or another legislator becomes friendly with, a different legislator who's running a bill that's awful, they feel a little bit compromised in their ability to push back against that bad bill, to fight that issue because, oh, he's so nice, or oh, he's a friend of mine, or whatever, and you start to allow these relational ties to inhibit you from standing up for what is right and what is wrong. And so you get this like good old boys club going along to get along. Sometimes that temptation can exist if we allow these relationships to override doing what we think is right. And so again, this barometer of, can we measure our impact and how well we're trying to build God's kingdom based off of, the level of persecution that exists? Is it a sign that people chanting F the Mormons and calling Mitt Romney a weirdo and Mormons, all this bigotry, could that be a lagging indicator of, the fact that, hey, this is where the truth is. We are, God's chosen people. We're trying to build his kingdom. Could be, right? That at least one element. Like, I'm not saying it's a perfect one-to-one relationship. Plenty of other people are persecuted. There's bigotry elsewhere as well. That doesn't automatically mean that those people are, favored and whatever. But it's interesting to think through. This is inevitable for those who are trying, especially in the last days, to build God's kingdom in preparation for the second coming. We ought to expect this, the mocking from the great and spacious building, right? The pointing of the fingers, people making fun of us. And it's an inevitable byproduct of those who are trying to follow the way of Christ, and forge his path, rather than, follow the broad roads that lead to that great and spacious building. So look, this type of stuff is going to continue. I think it'll largely have these undercurrents that'll, bubble up, as I said, in different sports games or whatever, where people are a little bit more tribalistic and energetic and so forth. But all of that is really just a manifestation of people's underlying sentiments. It's easier to express yourself like that when you're in a large group of people who are already expressing that. You feel safer in being bigoted that way. Whereas in polite company, maybe it would be like this guy in the 2011 article said, where he asks a colleague, you don't really believe that stuff, right? You'd still get these one-on-one encounters. You'd occasionally get the big tribalistic encounters. I don't know that there's a solve for it. Frankly, I think it's an inevitable outcome for those of us who are doing things that are countercultural in the best way, fighting the cult of Caesar, the cult of Satan, the cult of death all around us. That if we are countercultural, if we are building Christ's kingdom, that is inherently countercultural. And look at your scriptural history. Time and again, those who pushed back against the Caesar cults of the day, right? They were oppressed, they were attacked, they were persecuted, they were killed. So we might want to, be safe and ingratiate ourselves, and we're just like you and we're one of you, but we're not, and we shouldn't be. We're a peculiar people for a reason. God has called us out to flee Babylon, to touch not the unclean thing, right? Not to, just put a glove on first before you touch the unclean thing. It's like, stay away. And we need to be cautious of wanting to be liked and wanting to fit in. Of course, that doesn't mean we have to be mean or contentious ourselves. Of course not. Christ didn't say to, fight back when someone strikes you on your right cheek. He just said, turn the left cheek, throw them off a little bit, change the nature of the conversation so that they can see that you are social equals. I find that fascinating. I'd be curious in the comments, what do you think about that? How does that apply today if we have F the Mormon chants at sports stadiums, or bigotry from a colleague at work? How does Christ's teaching to turn the other cheek connect to how we should respond in those circumstances? How should we handle the last acceptable bigotry against members of the LDS Church? Is it just part of the price of being a Latter-day Saint, and there's a sense of inevitability and acceptability as a sign that we're trying to do the right thing and pushing against the cult and wasting and wearing out our life and bringing light hidden things of darkness? Or ought we to be doing something else? Is there a different response? I'm sincerely curious in the comments if you want to share your insights. How do you handle stuff like this? Or how do you think that we ought to handle it? Any different perhaps than we are? Maybe we ought to continue putting ads in playbills and just being a little bit lighthearted and soft-spoken, right? And not push back. Or do we stand our ground a little bit, demand to be seen as social equals, make it a little bit more uncomfortable for others to be bigoted against our faith? Change the nature of the conversation so that they can't wallow in their ignorance, but we're correcting the record. We're, asserting ourselves a bit more, not to fight back, but like the weakling on the playground who bulks up through puberty, like maybe we can flex our muscle a little bit more as a deterrence, perhaps. I don't know. These are just their thoughts, their musings. So share yours in the comments, and I'll see you next week.